A question a lot of game developers ask me when they're starting on their first game is, should they do early access? On the surface level, it sounds pretty solid. You get more feedback from the community, you can start earning revenue sooner because you can just release your game earlier, and this allows you to have a longer development cycle, making a better game without going broke. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of early access. For our own game, Forge Industry, it was a prime candidate to make an early access game out of it, but we decided against it as well. So in this video, I want to go a bit more about, what is early access, what's good about it, what should you watch out for, some tips as well if you are planning on doing early access, and then I'll also tell you just my personal opinion on it and just why we decided for Forge Industry not to do it. Now, probably most people already have some idea about what this early access thing is that I'm talking about, and it's something that Steam allows you to do if you're making a Steam game, and it basically means early development. You as the developer give out an earlier build of your game basically that isn't feature complete or that still has a lot of UI overhaul or graphic overhaul planned, but players can play it today already, and then they can give feedback and they can also often help shape the development of that game. Through balancing and more testing, you can see, okay, these are the aspects my players like the most, sort of like an extended play test where people can go really in depth already in your game. This doesn't always have to be on Steam, it's just called Steam Early Access usually. What you often see as well is, for example, games that start out on itch.io as simple prototypes and then end up evolving to Steam later on, but first it's a whole development cycle on itch or another platform. Now, why exactly do this early access? Well, I'm gonna be honest. You'll probably be saying oh, it's good for my community building, or I can get more feedback from the game. You just want to sell more. Or not really sell more, but sell earlier. Games generally don't get developed in just a few months. Our own game, Forge Industry, took 18 months of development, and 10 is already a relatively short development cycle. It's not unusual to see games that are 2 to 3 years by default, and then games that go up to 7-8 years of development. And in case of something like a Dwarf Fortress or a Star Citizen, 10+ years as well. And you usually can't bankroll that entire period by yourself, and even a publisher isn't going to fund you for that much money, especially if it's your first game. Chances are you won't even have a publisher. So this is where early access comes in really nicely, as it allows you to start earning money sooner. Once you have a game that is somewhat playable, that has your core gameplay in it, but maybe is still a bit rough around the edges, doesn't have the cleanest UI, isn't the most balanced yet, or has certain large features such as achievements and such not implemented yet, you can already start selling it through early access. And then usually you price it a little bit lower, but then in exchange people can hop in, buy an early copy and truly get invested in the development. And because of this investment, there's 2 more big benefits that I can think of. One is your feedback. Basically, you're not the only person planning the entire game, because especially for large scale games, and especially something like we do, like automation or city builder or colony sim games, there's so many mechanics usually that people want, and there's so many mechanics that you don't even know of, that having something that's more open and that has a lot of player feedback can really help. It also helps with, having a community already, because it's part of marketing as well. That community is going to talk to other people about how great the game is, if it's a good game. And also early access games can get covered by other YouTubers much easier than you sending out a demo build that is only for showcasing and that's it. Everything else is still, oh, you gotta wait for the full release. Those are the main reasons I think why you would go into early access. On the surface, it doesn't look really like you have that much to lose. But honestly, I wouldn't suggest you immediately dive into early access, because there's also some downsides that come with it. The big problem is that community. You basically have to sell them a vision. You have to give them this grand idea that in 2-3 years they'll have a completely new game that is completely different from what they're seeing right now, and it's going to be worth it, and they're gonna personally help shape the future of the game as well. This can be a problem in terms of managing expectations as well, because you'll be losing some people along the way who don't agree with your design visions, because of course your players can give all the feedback they want. If you as the developer don't implement it, well, some people won't feel that nice about it. We even have that now with Forge Industry, which is a released game where we get posts for example, oh, you should add terraforming, where we can simply be hey, we made this game, it's out, we're not going to add it, these are the reasons why. It's much harder to do something like this in early access because oh, it's early access, you can still change everything. People expect your scope to be very fluid as well and go into whatever is most popular, or even not that popular but has a loud minority. Then yeah, if you disappoint some of those people, or maybe you don't develop fast enough and the features take a bit longer than you had originally hoped, you'll start getting bad reviews reviews, for example, from people who are like, hey, this dev didn't commit to like what they were saying. You'll get hate mail, you'll get like bad posts on the communities as well. That's like, hey, this developer is a piece of garbage. He can't even finish his game. He's just a scammer and he's gonna take your money and run. Don't support him. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true, but regardless, it still usually sucks to read these kinds of comments, and it's not that great for your mental psyche because this is something you need to do for a long time. And that brings me to my third issue with early access, and it is that you have to commit for a very long time. Because usually a few months extra isn't going to be worth doing early access. If it's like, oh, my game is going to be fully released in 4 months, then don't really bother with early access. Early access is really for games that you want to get more from the community from. And I think another great example of this is a game like Flotsam. I personally know the developers, I've been talking very much with them, and this game has been in the making for 8 years, a bit over 4 of which has been in early access, and they're finally looking at some point in the next year or in 2 years to have their V1 release. And I always ask them, how do you just keep doing it? How do you work on the same project for 8 years? Especially for someone like me who's still quite young. 8 years ago, I was still like barely capable of tying my own shoelaces almost. And then imagine working for that long of a time on one game. It can be really easy to burn out almost on it because it's just so damn long and you get that feedback, and if it's not great feedback, you probably want to quit, but you can't quit because it's early access and then you're gonna get more bad feedback. So it can be a bit of a trap. Whereas if you just release a game and it's not in early access, you can move on to something new without that much of a problem. Once you go into early access, you have to commit and you can't just drop it midway through. Be like, okay, this idea is not gonna work, I'm gonna move on to the next project. And then one last thing that I think early access also can be a bit of a trap for developers is people don't always like early access because it has that bad rep. So you'll get a lot of wish lists, but you'll have a much lower conversion rate because people look at a game and they're like, oh, this is early access. I don't really want to spend my money on this right now. I'll maybe wishlist it, or maybe they'll just move on. And if you have a wish list that's like 2 years old, well, that's most likely not going to convert anymore. Now, early access also isn't for every genre. There are some genres that really thrive on early access. That's something like what we had: automation games, city builder games, colony sims. All of those strategy games usually can work really well in early access because strategy is something that mechanics can be added upon, and you'll probably have balancing tweaks and updates and things like that. So generally, this is a pretty solid genre to do early access for. You also see it with, for example, sandbox games or sandbox survival games, as you can start those pretty rough and then keep on evolving to them. I feel like honestly more than half of all of the like sandbox survival games started as early access games at some point, or are even still in early access. The fact that it says early access doesn't always mean that it's a crap game. I think a great example of this, like I said, is Flotsam. It's still an early access game, but honestly, you could have told me that it was like a released game and it still sounds and looks pretty solid. It's just the developers have decided that, you know, it's not quite there yet in their vision. Now, there are also some genres where I would suggest you stay away from it, and mainly these are things that are narrative driven. I know Hades has done like an early access system, but it's really hard to pull off, especially if it's one of your first games, because your players don't want half a story. They want the full story from the beginning, because usually you can't just dump them with like half a story and then be like, oh yeah, the rest is coming in like 6 months. For things like books, that works because it's always still tied up neatly at the end, or if you have something like a Life is Strange where it's like different chapters, you probably won't be doing this. And I also wouldn't recommend that you try. I think you should just focus on making a game first. Another genre that also is a bit harder is when it's like really puzzle games, where it's more like really puzzle driven and you don't want these puzzles to be spoiled. And there's also less value that you can give the player through early access. Like, what are you gonna do? You're just usually locking like more levels or like a level editor or something like that, where players don't really feel that lenient into being like, hey, okay, I can live with this being early access, because it's like this whole game is done, you just need to make more content for it. That usually doesn't go as well. All right, so you've decided I'm doing early access. Great idea, let me give you some more tips. First off, make sure your core gameplay and mechanics are implemented, and they're implemented quite well. They've already been through some playtesting. Don't focus too much on the art, and don't focus on like your wish list of mechanics you would have at a later point, but have something unique already. One of the big problems that gives early access its bad rep is like all of those survival sandbox games where it's, you know, it's nothing new. It's just, oh, I chop trees release, I build a base, and then it's like, oh yeah, it's early access, all the other content is coming later. Don't do that. Have something like real to show the player already that you are doing something unique compared to all of the other studios. Don't release too early as well. I know you guys like money and you like releasing your game, but you can't develop for 1 month and whatever you have then you can already put online. It does take a bit more polish than that. And there's definitely an art to it when you shouldn't release too early, but you also don't want to release too late, because then it's like, what's the point of the early access? Because you're gonna release soon anyway. My next tip is to have someone who's dedicated to the community. If you want to do this early access thing right, you should have someone who can at least like 20 hours a week, or like as a part-time job, just focus on interacting with the community, being in Discord servers, setting up update calls, making like devlog videos about the progress on the game, interacting with the forums, creating the roadmaps, and just making sure that the development is as open and transparent as possible. This takes a lot of time. We're not early access, but I understand this community management part because we're making these YouTube channels, and this is basically 20 to 30 hours a week of my time that goes into this. So if I was a solo developer, where would I find the time to actually make the games? We have other people in our team here who just have to focus on the programming and on making the game well, and it allows us to keep developing games even though I'm spending quite a bit of time here. So get someone who's good at community management. And then also keep in mind that you have to be transparent. If you don't want to get angry people coming to you and you don't want to disappoint people because, you know, what they expected of the game is completely different than what you actually delivered, you have to be as open about the development as possible, and you need to have plans. Not just plans for what are you doing in the next 3 months, but plans basically on this is everything we want to do in the next 2 years basically. Plan as far ahead as you can think, and if things change, update those plans and keep informing the community as well. This is probably the most important part, and this is also why I say get that dedicated community manager, because this will take some time, but you do need to keep this in mind when you're going open development style. And then last thing is also related to that planning. I said 2 years. Honestly, if you really want to do this well, have your exit strategy ready. When are you releasing your game? If you can tell a player from the beginning, this is how long we're gonna take, this is what we currently have, and this is the point in time where we feel like we've reached a V1 release, this is gonna give them a lot more trust that you actually know what you're doing. And it also just helps you. I always say in these videos that you need to have plannings, you need to think ahead. And the only difference here is that now your plans need to be in like a stylized picture that you can post on like your forums or on like your Discord server, instead of just being like an ugly Excel list or like a milestone in your issue tracker. All right, so why did we not do early access? Because honestly, our game would have been a perfect candidate for early access. If we look at like our closest competitor, Factory Town, they did early access. It worked great for them, or at least as far as I can tell. And the reason honestly was very simple. Nobody in our team likes early access games. So we didn't feel like we in good consciousness could make an early access game. We've all been burned on previous projects, and we all felt that, you know, early access isn't the way to go, because we don't want to commit 7 years and then be like, oh, well, you can't blame us because this is still an early access game. This is a purely subjective opinion. Keep this in mind, and you'll probably roast me in the comments for it as well. But I do think that you should have some ethics and morals in your game development, even if that means that you won't be making as much money or you won't be getting as much feedback. I think I'm still happier now knowing that I've delivered something that I am happy with, instead of something that the community has had like all of their grubby fingers in and has turned it into something that I didn't really like anymore. Also, when we go to events, we always say that we are not an early access game, and people love it. When we showcase our game, people ask us like, oh, is this an early access game? And we're like, no, this is not. You get the full game, you get it right now. We don't like early access ourselves, and everyone vibes with that. Everyone understands it, and everyone is like, okay, this makes me believe that you guys know what you're doing, or not really know what you're doing, but more like, I support this idea. I hope this mindset change goes throughout all of like game development. So here's my support. I am getting the game and I'm looking forward to playing it. I think early access also, just in general, for most developers, I wouldn't do it personally, because it's just that much extra time commitment. And honestly, you shouldn't be making a 4-year-long game for your first 2 to 3 games, honestly. You won't have the funding for it really, you won't have the experience for it, and you'll have too much shiny object syndrome making you want to hop around to different projects, and you just have to commit if you do this early access thing. So I hope this helps a bit more in explaining early access. If you have any further questions, you can hop into our Discord, or you can talk to us as well. I wanted to just give a quick plug for that. And apart Apart from that, if you're new here, we're game developers. We make videos about game development, or for example, our experiences when we made our own games. So if that's something that you're interested in, be sure to head down below and subscribe, as it really helps us out. And you get these videos twice a week, so it's a win-win for both of us. Anyways, that's all I really had to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!